Hello, my name is Kristen Womack, and I'm here today to talk about roadmaps and how we can use system log data and monitoring and the practice of DevOps culture and feedback into our roadmaps to improve our planning. So when we're thinking about where we're going with software, we usually start with a roadmap that lays out the work that we're going to do, the goals that we have, the vision we have for our product, and what we want to build. And at this point now, we're all really, I think, have arrived at the same place that we need to be able to iteratively adjust to what's going on with the market or what's happening with our customers. We no longer see a lot of waterfall projects. It's mostly Scrum and Kanban and lots of flavors of Agile. And the core central theme to DevOps and jobs to be done, Agile, all these different methodologies and frameworks of working, all has to do with learning. And so with that central theme of learning, we have all these practices and disciplines that give us the promise of bringing that to life. So we have things like TDD and BDD, and we have stand-ups, and we have continuous integration and deployment. And all of this is really great, but usually our work tends to look a little bit more like this, where it's executive or leadership, top-level work coming down towards the rest of the organization. And we do need the balance of having goals set and a vision from the top and an understanding of where we're going. But what happens is that the market's going so quickly and things are happening very rapidly, and we want to know when things will be ready. So leaders tend to ask us for our plan. When will we have this in production? When is this feature ready? When can I depend on this? And for some product deployments, this is really important because you have to time it with what you're releasing to the public and announcements that you have. But in theory, it really doesn't help us to realize the promise of DevOps. And so if we have this continuous flow back into planning from our operations, deployment, monitoring, and coming right back into this continuous flow, then we can take a look at what's happening with our product in the marketplace and in production and start to uncover insights that are there. But too often, we end up having our work scheduled out in 2-week iterations and quite a bit in advance. And so all of our work is sequenced, and we know what we're doing across all these iterations. But what happens when we lay out our work like this is we're just going through the motions, and we're not taking into account what we can learn from what's happening in production. And at this point, we're not able to really live that continuous flow. So we have to figure out how can we really, really incorporate the learning. So sequencing your backlog in 2-week iterations might feel safe, and it might feel a little bit more planful. But really, you do not have more control, and in fact, you're more likely to have more throwaway code or more technical debt that you're purchasing as you go along the way. So we really don't want to schedule our work incrementally in 2 weeks, even though we do maybe want to use sprints and iterations to work through our work. It's just sequencing out like that is not working. So we need more sane roadmaps. And here's kind of an example of something that's become a little bit more popular recently, where you have your current vision, and right there it's very fine-grained, and you start to look at the bits of what you're building in a little bit more detail, and then as you widen out a little bit, you start to see that you have more flexibility for incorporating things that you are learning real time. And then further out, it's more high level, and it's a broad scope. So this pairs really well with that glue that comes back from monitoring back into planning. And I believe that DevOps is really the best position to live this realization of bringing learning back into our roadmaps and having more sane roadmaps. So here's a really specific example of how we can execute on a roadmap like this. So you can see this is a fictional quarterly roadmap for 2019, and in Q1 you can see that the features are pretty granular and they run across themes. Across the entire year, you have goals and objectives and key metrics. But as you get further out, your theme is more at the ideal level in the next quarter, and then further out, you might have a theme but not have any meat to what is under the theme, and then even further out, it's just a possible theme. This type of roadmap is, I have found, to bring it forward to executives and leadership, and a lot of times they ask, well, what are you building in Q4? You have nothing lined up. And this is an opportunity to have that conversation. Or, if you are in this room and you are at the executive level, or you're a leader and you are looking at roadmaps, maybe challenge your teams and ask them how they're going to get everything done if they have sequenced their work in that way. So who am I, and why am I here to talk about more sane roadmaps? Well, I wanted to share a little bit more about my background and the credentials that I have in terms of building roadmaps. So I was a part of BestBuy.com's digital transformation, so leading and working on spearheading the effort to go from annual deployments to weekly deployments. And after that, I was the head of the Best Buy API platform, and we really worked very hard on building that continuous deployment pipeline from dev to stage. They never let us go to prod. They probably do that today, but they didn't let us go to production. And so we were the first team to do that. And I was also the head of product at a venture-backed startup, leading product folks and really experimenting on how to change and use more sane roadmaps. I've been building API products for the last 10 years, everything from data APIs to transactional APIs, including mobile phone activations. Currently, I'm building a marketplace product that's called Hello Mom, and I consult on product prototypes on the side and how to get going and building your roadmap. So before all this, I was actually studying to be a sign language interpreter. So I like to think of myself as living in the center of the Venn diagram of product, technology, and culture. When I was with the Best Buy API team, we had an external product catalog API, and our sales team would talk a lot about the different ways that they needed features to work within this API and the different ways that you could cut across the data. So you can see here, it's a little fuzzy diagram, but it's one of my favorite examples. You can see, or if you can't see, across the top, it gives you different ways to search across the product catalog. So search by SKU is that yellow column that should jump right out to you from this picture. And so most developers that were using our product catalog would search by the product SKU. But there are other ways to do it. You could search by ID, by ratings. You could cut across the product catalog across different facets. And the one challenge that we really had was that the business folks kept coming to us and insisting that we needed even more reasons and ways to cut across the product catalog and query the API. But we found when we put this together that our market wasn't telling us the same thing. Developers were primarily using one specific way, one specific feature of our API, and then some of them were gone completely unused at all. So the market was also... we were seeing this, we weren't the only people to see this play out. So what you're looking at here is a diagram from Intercom, and they talk about if you were to take your product and map features out across a diagram like this, where your upper right quadrant is features that are used all the time by all the people, or most of the features used by all the people, all the features used by most of the people, and that lower right quadrant is where you really don't want to see a lot of your product features live. And then if you do, maybe you want to consider removing them from your product, especially the ones that are features that are used all the time or most of the time by a few of the people. This causes a lot of noise in our backlogs and in our roadmaps. And so when people come to us and they say that they want different things in the roadmap or on the backlog, it's important that we figure out how to synthesize that information. So here, this just becomes a lot of noise in your plan, and it's hard to really see the forest for the trees when you live in what I like to call a special place called story hell, where you're just sifting through hundreds and hundreds of stories in your backlog, and it's really hard to assemble that narrative at that point. So roadmaps become really noisy and cluttered, and it's a particular type of story hell that I just described. This really crowds out all the room to let those clues from production come back into your planning map. So realizing that full loop coming through. So where does all of these inputs come from? So well-meaning and well-intended and also incredibly important data from our customers, data from the marketplace, and then also just analytics data. And a lot of things come from sales teams, executives, even development and operations and we're seeing these things as well. So these are all inputs going into the roadmap, but it creates a lot of noise. And what you really want to do is figure out how to intentionally build feedback loops that help you synthesize that data and figure out what goes into your strategic roadmap and what you decide not to build. Deciding what not to build is often the hardest part, say no. But intentional and well-designed feedback loops help us stay in touch with this changing landscape. If we're living in story hell and we're 300 stories deep and we're backlog grooming and we're just kind of heads down, it's easy to look up and find that the land around you has completely shifted. And, I think this is what happened before I joined Best Buy when they were doing annual deployments. I mean, it really sounds crazy right now to think about deploying software only once a year. But I think the way that they got there at the time was more and more complexity with each deployment just kept moving it further out, and trust kept separating further and further between the business and technology. So as you have to wait longer for things to go in production, then the business is more eager to get as much as they can and stuff it full into their deployments. And so, you don't want the landscape to change around you. If you are able to iterate and put everything right back into the planning cycle, you're less likely to find yourself doing big bang releases or changes to your software. So a really interesting report recently came out by Stripe called the Developer Coefficient and talks about the software engineering efficiency opportunity. And they estimate it at a $3 trillion impact on global GDP. So if it's not enough reason just to do it for your own product, but thinking about the opportunity we have globally to really change economies, provide jobs, this is really big. And in that same report, they found that bad code cost companies $85 million annually, or $85 billion, excuse me. The reason this is really important is that when they interviewed leaders and developers, what they found is that leadership teams and hiring managers described the biggest threat to success being access to developers, not access to capital. So the threat to success was access to developers not being available. Even though we have many software developers coming into the industry, this is a huge problem. So how do we use the talent that already exists within our companies? And you may have heard of Conway's Law before. So this kind of dovetails nicely into the idea that when you have an organization that designs a system, that system will then become a direct copy of that organization's communication structure. So when you have a lot of chaos and churn, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the developer report I just showed you, but this is really a thing to think about when you're building your systems, especially if you're building microservices, for example. If you're working on a microservices architecture, there's a book that came out about a year or so ago by Susan Fowler, and it talks about deployment-ready microservices. Most of that book is actually how to design the architecture of the system that you want based on really designing the organizational structure. So if you think about intentionally designing behaviors, feedback loops, and intentional design of how you work, you're really going to start to build better systems. And this is really important specifically to DevOps because today I want to give you a few specific tactics that you can take forward to use in your organization. The people who usually write and create roadmaps are product managers, product owners, leadership managers, but there's a lot of confusion in the software industry around product management. Some organizations have product managers living in the engineering department, some are in marketing departments. Depending on how your organization is structured, you might get a different outcome. Especially, for example, if your product managers live in marketing, they're far less likely to approach operations and ask and dig in about logs and alerts that are coming up in the website and dig in deep into the technical information. So these tactics could be employed by anyone in the company, but really if we start to have developers and operations folks and product managers and leadership really embracing the idea of figuring out where we're going together by using hints and clues into how our users are using our software, we're more likely to realize that full continuous flow within DevOps. So really intentionally thinking about how your organization is structured, there is this concept of learning organizations. So learning organizations employ system design in terms of how they communicate and how they work. And there's a couple of really good studies about how these type of organizations outdistance their competition because they're able to continuously refine what they're building. One of the most frequent used examples that we know of is Toyota. So I'm going to paraphrase the story, but it goes a little something like this, where there's a car assembly line, and it gets to the portion where they put the door on the car, and there's something that just doesn't quite fit. And so then they figure out they can get a rubber mallet and just adjust it a little bit, and voila, perfect car, ready to ship. But at Toyota, they would never really let that ship and accept the idea of a new roll rubber malleting into place this car door at the end of the assembly line. They would stop the assembly line, go back, and figure out where upstream did this happen. And you can do this in software. You know, where upstream is your data getting corrupt? Where upstream do you have deployment issues? Or are you letting a bug continuously go through to downstream systems that you have to continuously add processes to blunt the impact of that? So stopping that assembly line, fixing the door, and then by the time it gets further down the assembly line, you're installing the door, it closes, everything is ready to ship. So this is the idea of how we want to start thinking about our software systems. And if you really take the time to design your culture by shifting these behaviors, it's incredible, but it takes a lot of discipline. So I promise you it's worth it. Right now, we have all these methodologies that speak to the idea of build, measure, learn, but it feels as if we maybe are skipping the learn part sometimes, and we're just building, and we may be doing some analytics and monitoring, but there's ways that we can improve and realize that continuous flow. So this is important because we want to move faster, we want to adapt to market changes, we want to be able to ship more quickly, we want to be able to answer the question about when we can ship a feature when our leaders are asking, and we want to be able to pivot and make changes. So we need to build in the space to learn. And if we do this, the Stripe report says that we have a $3 trillion opportunity, as I mentioned. So this is all about using the collective potential of developers, and a lot of them are sitting right in our organizations today. So DevOps is really well positioned because we have this idea of continuous integration, continuous deployments, continuous delivery. It's this promise of just continually automating and getting a flow state in our products. And the two really major tenets that I see that DevOps comes together with roadmaps is the idea that automation gives humans more time to think about problems. So the more we find something that we are doing manually and we can automate it, it removes the opportunity for human error, and it also allows us to have that extra time to think through more complex problems. So the more we can automate away the work that is repetitive and error-prone, the better. And advanced monitoring within DevOps gives us information where we can dig in deeper and find meaning behind that information. And so for this reason, I think that DevOps and working together with product can really bring this full circle. So we intentionally designed system feedback loops, and we understand what our users are telling us. This comes up through data patterns that emerge in our work. And today I'm going to give you 5 specific tactics on how you can build upon this and use it in your roadmap. So the first thing I want to talk about is escaping vanity metrics. Vanity metrics are those type of things when you're running around talking about and celebrating that you've hit this many users for the week, or every day we have this many users signing up, or you have this top level metric that you're celebrating but maybe not digging deeper into the depths of what's happening, and you really need to be able to cut through the fog to figure out what's going on. So in this example, this is talking about the shift from vanity metrics to actually figuring out what a valuable partnership means at the bottom of your marketing funnel. So what you're looking at on the left is signups. This is about 6 years of product data, API signups, and it's just a steady climb. Every single day over day, week over week, year over year, very little change. People continuously sign up, and for a long time, this was a metric that was celebrated. Until we started digging in and saying, okay, we have this many people signing up. What does an active user mean, and how many active users do we have in the system? So it's great that we have thousands and thousands of developers signing up, but how many people are really using our API? So we started digging in, and when we graphed this, we realized, the active developers aren't really growing at the same rate as the signups. So in this case, is our product really falling down somewhere where it's not living its full potential? So we started digging through the logs, and pretty soon we started finding little clusters of data pockets that were like 5 people signed up with the same email domain, or a handful of people over here had the same area code. So we knew they were together when they signed up, or that they were somehow interrelated. So we came across this group of 5 email addresses that were all harvard.edu. And so we actually reached out to them and we said, hey, 5 of you signed up for our API, but then you never made an active call to our API. Can you tell us a little bit more about the situation, or what caused you to check out our API and then abandon it? And so what they explained to us, and we had not even considered at the time, was that they were at a hackathon and they were under pressure to get signed up to use the API so that they could use our data in the project they were building. And so several of them tried and they just couldn't get through, so they moved on. So then looking at it through this lens, we had some disagreement on the product team about if a hackathon developer was really our persona. And our argument was, if a hackathon developer needs to get something done in less than 3 minutes, understand what your API does in 30 seconds, sign up for a key in 30 seconds, and in 2 minutes actually make a call. Like, if we can make it that easy for those developers, then we've really covered many use cases of developers everywhere, because who wouldn't want to have a fast and expedient onboarding process? So as we started to dig into that and make changes, then we were able to see the yellow line and the blue line start to go up together, because we were able to discover that there's something deeper happening with our product, and we weren't able to see it because we were too busy celebrating the top level the line. So if you can take your vanity metric, whatever it is, it's usually at the top of your funnel, then figure out what are those conversion points, because you'll lose people along the line, but what you want to do is get people to convert at each point, so that at the bottom you have whatever is your most meaningful relationship with that customer. So the next example about vanity metrics is, I actually realized when I got here that I don't think Lyft is here in Munich. So I don't know how many people are familiar with Lyft, but basically it's a car service where you can call a car from your mobile app, and then it will come to you and take you where you go. You get out, and the payment is automatically taken care of. So you might be looking at the throughput, which is like how many rides are you doing per day, and that would be more of a vanity metric. Whereas if you start to look at, okay, how long is the average time for time to pick up based on distance, and how many calls happen between the rider and the driver between pickup and when they call their car, indicating maybe there's a deeper problem, or how many canceled trips are. And the more you start peeling back and digging in, the better you can improve whatever your product is, because you're starting to get a finer level of understanding of what makes the user excited and delighted, and remove barriers along their way. So the sooner you can start to figure out what is the one metric that matters to your product, the more you can start to realize the next tactics I'm going to give you. So the next one is to visualize the data. So once you figure out what data you want to look at, then start to take some of your system data, especially like log data. I'm a really big fan of taking your system data and your log data and figuring out how to reduce the noise and then visualize it, so that you can start to derive meaning for it, or even provide dashboards for people who are making decisions. So you can help guide them to make decisions that are really more informed with your product. So on the right, you can see that, or maybe you can't see, I don't know if you can see it in the back, but basically this is 14 years of data across about 10 different teams, and all this is their employees. So in one simple graph, you can see across several years, and you can start to see the story that shapes each of these companies. So Yahoo, for example, is just a quick little blurb, and they never really shoot up and have any type of exponential growth, and there's a lot of reasons now. Hindsight is 2020, and this is already a 5-year-old graph, so we can now start to derive what that meaning is. But you can see Amazon just has exponential, continuous growth. It just keeps climbing, whereas Microsoft is more of a steady growth. So you can start to put together these patterns and see the narrative behind it. Edward Tufte is one of my favorite people when it comes to visualizing information. So he has a course where it's a full day. You go and you get all 4 of his books, and then he goes through all these different ways that you can visualize data to find information. And this is what he deems the best like statistical chart or informational graph that is ever lived in history. So basically, this is the Napoleon 1812 March, and what you can see are about 6 different data points just in one glance, which tells you a story. So you can see the geography of about 400 soldiers marching on Russia, and on the border where they start, you can see that the line is really wide, so that's about 400 people, but then when they come back, the line is black, and you get to see the grave nature of how many lives were lost in this duration of time. And so you have the lives lost, the duration of time, the geography. You even can see temperature, which plays into probably why so many lives were lost, in addition to being at war, and you can see a ton of information, and not once is there a big bold label that says what each thing is. So the more you can take a picture of your data and figure out how to assemble the narrative behind what's going on with your product without cluttering it up too much, then it's a lot easier to say, maybe your recommendation of where the product should go. And I think a lot of times operations teams, development teams, product teams see things in ways that maybe leadership doesn't, and you know in your gut that you should be going in this direction, or that this feature should not be built, or this feature should be. And when you can assemble your data that's coming out of your system logs in a way that presents meaningful information, or the meaning behind the information, the conversation is much more rich. So escaping visual vanity metrics and then visualizing the data, the next thing that you want to do once you are able to visualize the data is find user patterns. So what I've been talking about so far is this idea of making meaning out of jumbled real-life experiences. This is something that Clayton Christensen talks about, assembling the narrative of the job to be done. So the job to be done is a phenomenon that is like moving past the Scrum user story and really talking about when a user has a job to be done, they employ a certain product to fulfill that job. And I'll show you an example of that in just a second. So we're all familiar with this story, the Scrum story. As a user, I want so that I can. This is meant to really bring you closer to the person, to the user, but it ends up sounding really stale and monotonous and cold and not really understanding what's happening. It quite honestly reminds me of way back in the day when you would have spreadsheets that would say the system shall, and it would just tell you what code to write. So in jobs to be done theory, many people in the space are talking about how, the persona is quite irrelevant, and the action is maybe built with too many assumptions that is the right action. So how do you really build the right product at that point? So the shift is to talk more situational. When this happens, I want to so that I can. So an example of this is Alan, he's hungry, so he employs a Snickers when he's hungry, and that's the job to be done. He doesn't buy a Snickers because he's a 35-year-old person in marketing who wants to retire by the time he's 55, and he drives a Honda. These are all irrelevant and distracting to what we're really trying to build. So when you're thinking about what people are trying to accomplish in their life and how your software or your product is going to help them accomplish that, it's a new framing of thinking about how you're doing this. So in the States, there's a software called TurboTax, and you enter all of your details, so all of your income and the codes, and it sort of calculates what your taxes are and that you either pay or that maybe you are refunded. So in Clayton Christensen's book, they go into depth about this example. If you're always talking about as the user, I want to enter all of my information, and then you start to iterate on the fields and making sure you have all the right things for the user to input. But really, if you peel it back and you think about what is the job to be done, the job to be done is to do your taxes and to not spend a lot of time on them. You don't want to sit there and enter information. And so then the team came up with the idea of getting the job done maybe has has less to do about information and just taking a picture of your tax document so that it can just pull in all the data and then put that into the system for you. So starting to really think deeper about your product. So, for example, when you have an e-commerce site like Best Buy or really any e-commerce site that also has a store, you think that you're trying to sell products and that your conversion rate is, how do I get people to put items in the cart? What's the conversion rate from the cart to checkout and payment? And that's your measurement, maybe even your vanity metric. But really, at Best Buy, when we were doing the digital transformation, of course, people want more features. How do I show our product in this way? How do I have reviews? How do I cut across the product this way? How do I add more things to the cart for features? But really, what we found that we should be prioritizing is stability. Because when you have a website that is an e-commerce site and you also have a store, it turns out that when your website's down, your store traffic also goes down. And in Best Buy's case, we found that in some instances it was going down as much as 75% in the stores. So that's huge. So that tells you that people are really going to your website to check store availability, store hours, pricing, all kinds of information that may have nothing to do with checking out. So it might be quite fine to have a conversion rate on an e-commerce site that's really low. In fact, the industry conversion rate for many retailers is under 3%, pretty low. But driving that traffic to your store. So then you think about the features that maybe you would prioritize, or maybe even like a redundant failover where you could have a landing page that maybe just looks up store information and you don't even get to browse. And how do you start to think about your product in this way? So you have an API, let's say, and you want to sign up for an API developer key. So this is what Twilio does. Their whole product is APIs. And, as you're working on a product like this, you might think like, how do we get people to sign up more quickly? How do they make their first API call that's meaningful? And how do you move them down along that way? But if you sit back and you actually look at the data that's coming out of your systems, you might find what Netflix found in 2014 when they shut down their public API, that less than 1% of their API traffic was actually coming from open or external developers. Really, most of their traffic was internal. And a previous slide that Daniel Jacobson had referenced had like a sliver that was red. And he said that even that isn't accurate. So this one doesn't even have a sliver because the amount is so small. So this would fall in that category of that lower left quadrant that I showed you earlier of, or maybe even the top right quadrant, where people are using all of your features, but maybe there's just a few of them. How do you make your product less noisy by removing, features where maybe when you're interacting with the public that takes a great deal of your time, but then it becomes noisy and you're not able to focus on the core users that really are the central of your product. So the next tactic I want to talk about after we've come down this road of figuring out what metric to use, and then we're visualizing it and finding patterns, but how do you start to monitor from within your application? So instead of just layering on top, and I think you're probably familiar with, maybe you start out and you say like, oh, we're going to do have automated test coverage across our whole application, but you write your test after you write your code. So then, when you start to lose time and you need to make up some things, the first thing that goes is writing the test after because you already have the feature. And so this is how technical debt starts to slowly pile up. So if you monitor from within, and really, at your starting point, you can change the dynamic of how you're building software. So putting this into your roadmap. Kelsey Hightower did a talk a few years ago about about monitoring from within, and I would highly recommend this talk. He does a live demo, which is a lot of fun, and talks about how if you monitor from within, especially if you're doing a deployment, as opposed to having a health check page external to your application and pinging your application, how do you know if that is even accurate? Maybe you're going to experience cross-network issues, or there's all kinds of things that can come up if you just layer on top. And so he gives a few really good examples. And I want to talk a little bit more about TDD. So I was on a team once who, we were an XP team, and we really took it quite seriously about test-driven development, paired programming, all of the tenets of XP. And so every day what it looked like is we would stand at the stand-up board and pick off a test or a story, and we would sit down, and everyone would pair. So we didn't have any solo devs. And within each pair, what would happen is one person would write a failing test, the next person would write the code that passed, and then they'd keep going back and forth. If a story lasted for more than one day, the next day, the least experienced person on that team would stay, and the other person would roll off. And the next day, that new person would stay, and the more experienced person on that story would roll off. And so the idea was to really make sure that we were building in quality in the beginning in two ways. One, which tests that are built in to our continuous integration all the way from our own environment to, so at the unit test level, at the integration level, and even all the way up until production, so that when you get there, you can basically check your application. At the time, we were using Jenkins, and it was easy to just give the deployment team our Jenkins page so that they could check to see if all the tests passed and where the issues were. But the second reason is to reduce all these silos of information and have people who know every bit of your application by rotating through these stories. So you're really building all of this in instead of layering it on top. So really powerful. And in fact, with that team, we actually got a tester for 25% of the time. So the team was 8 developers, a project person, and a product owner. And we got a developer for 25% of the time to do some exploratory testing and help us have a tester. And she was bored. And so she left us and said, I'm going to give my 25% to another team. And for at least 5 years, this team has been one of the most stable applications. In fact, a team and an application that other teams would come to and say, we started noticing something in production or in this lower environment. How are your tests running? Like, what's going on? And so it became sort of really de facto in the department. And really all we did was just adhere to writing our test first and committing to that process and behavior change, and that's what influenced our culture. So the next thing I want to talk about is not just monitoring from within your application, but also monitoring your culture. So when you're monitoring culture, there's a couple ways that you can do this. You can actually take a look at software and DevOps. So there's a new book called Accelerate, and this is the latest work of Nicole Fengren and Jez Humble and Jean Kim. And it's actually, I just saw Nicole's birthday, so if you follow her on Twitter, maybe wish her a happy birthday. But they have been doing the State of DevOps report, and they put together this book, and it talks about practices that development and operations team employ and the results that they have. And it's at this larger industry level. So you can see, without a doubt, where the correlations are. Then you can look across industries and look more strategically at high-level things. And in Chasing the Rabbit, they across hospitals and manufacturing and really talk about creating a learning organization. So what kind of culture do you want in terms of what outcomes do you want for your product? And then in that same regard, how do you shape the behaviors to shape your culture? And with that, Albert Einstein was saying that everything that can be counted doesn't necessarily count. And there are things that count that cannot necessarily be measured. So maybe you can't measure your internal team culture in the same way that they do at the DevOps book, and you need to really think about it from a soft skills perspective. On one of the teams I had, we had a team manifesto, and so it was the tenets of things that we subscribe to. So we believe in learning, and so we believe in test-driven development. We value these things. So all of our values then could cascade into what our practices were. When we did our bigger retrospectives, looking back at our manifesto, a lot of times we would measure ourselves to say, well, we did this that didn't really work, and it actually went against some of our principles. So do we need to change our manifesto, or do we need to change our behaviors? And measuring back and forth between, taking a sanity check to say, are we doing what we say we want to do? And if not, let's do it, or let's change what we say we're doing. So this can be really powerful in terms of thinking about your feedback loops. This is from XP programming, but you can really think about at each level, what do you want to design for your feedback loop in terms of data, in terms of market, in terms of velocity of how quickly you're building, in terms of what your team culture is. So you can apply this in many different ways. So those are 5 tactics that we can use to really dig into our logs and figure out exactly what that deeper narrative is for your customers. So, that's the final outcome, right? No. Complex systems and service work is really never done. So there's no mission accomplished. If you're part of a DevOps program or a DevOps transformation or a digital transformation, you might have heard before leaders come to you and say, like, when are we done transforming? Are we done yet? Are we done yet? So you're either going to admit that you are always going to be in this perpetual state of transforming how you work, or if you want to have a finished date that you can celebrate and say, we have made it, we are officially digitally transformed, then you can definitely add to your roadmap down the way that you will be doing it again. Because it's a continuous practice that you have to work to achieve, and there is really no final outcome. We end up in places where we need to do digital transformations in big bang ways because we have let technical debt languish and things that we have sort of decided at the time to go faster and push those back. So this is a really cool presentation by a woman named Lynn, and she talks about the material of outcome in design, but most of her principles can also be brought back into technical teams and software. So if we really treat our product data like a conversation with the market, we're really likely to uncover what's happening with that. It's a conversation with our users and with the market, and then we can start to build better features that delight our customers, achieve the jobs that they're trying to accomplish, and have less feature bloat. So when we're doing this, we want to figure out what clues are living in our logs and how do we get to them? How do we get to our system data, and how do we create meaning from that? What you really want to walk away from here today, or what I want you to walk away from, is the understanding that you want to double down on what users love, and don't be afraid to not build the additional features that people keep asking you for. That is noise, bloat. It's going to cause you to go faster. It's going to be more to maintain from technical aspects, cognitive load, culturally, etc. So everything really comes down to culture. So we know, we were talking about this developer coefficient and like the efficiency opportunity. So in this report, they found that about half the week, we're really approaching 50% here, of developer time that is not being used effectively. So it's either going to technical debt or bad code. And like I said, the biggest threat to success right now is access to development talent, not to capital. So when we're thinking about this, we really want to think about like, how do we reduce that nearing 50% side of the pie? Turns out developers really want this as well. If you look at the top level, the third one down says, or if you can't see this in the back, it says, how much of a negative impact does each of the following have on your personal morale? So not being given sufficient time to fix poor quality code is right there in the middle of this first section. And so that's huge, but then also the changing priorities. So changing priorities that result in throwaway code or technical debt has a real strain on morale, because if you've ever built something and had to throw it away, or the software gets shelved because somebody decided not to ship it or it wasn't ready, it's so painful. And when you're thinking about code that you're diving into or products that have a lot of technical debt, it's very important to remember that the software you're building today is actually tomorrow's technical debt. So when you think about how your organization is structured and what that communication structure is like, and the thought that it goes back into your design structure, your system design, you can start to see that technical debt that you're faced with today might be a result of not that person who wrote the code or the pair that wrote the code, but maybe even the whole organization structure at that point. And so, where your first opportunity might be like, I can't believe somebody did this. Where are all the tests? Why does the software work like this? Who thought this was a good idea? Like, we're doing that today if we're not saying no to bloat that's coming into our roadmaps, and we're throwing away the opportunity to write the test when we can write them, and we're taking shortcuts to try to go faster. So I think that's really important. So the last point I want to make here is where you, so they ask the developers, which of the following do you believe would hinders your productivity? And the second one here is leadership prioritization of projects and tasks. So that ranks pretty high, and this is something we should take quite seriously as an organization. So if you are in the room and you're a leader, like, this is something to walk away and dig into. How can you say no to more things? But if you're in operations or product or development and you're trying to influence leaders and people who are writing the product roadmaps, digging into some of these logs and finding some of the things that you're closer to, and then partnering up with somebody, like, especially if you can find graphic designer. Like, I should have probably found a graphic designer for the very first example I showed you with the pink and the yellow and the green. Graphic designers can really communicate information in a way that even dashboards are challenged to show. So how can you really take that and influence your organization? Because these are features too. So if you don't need to just have like a shiny button or a shiny this or that as your feature, like, users and customers really do want to have more secure applications. They might not say, I wish your application was more secure. Or maybe they do after they have a data breach, which seems to be more and more common every day and becoming increasingly more important for us to think about how we are managing our systems. But they will say, like, once their data is hacked, then that's definitely a pain point that they're going to talk about. And again, this really comes back to our system design. So how we're writing our code, how we're designing our processes, what our organizational systems are really important. So with the Equifax breach that happened in the last year, the password and the admin login and password were literally admin. And when I read that, one of the first things I thought of is, like, who does this? Like, it's so natural and human to just say, like, why did anyone think that is a good idea? It's just terrible. But it really reflects more of the organizational process and how people are working together. So if you don't trust or employ, like, password log managers or different things, or share that, or become more mature in the way that you share information, of course it's going to be admin, because maybe you have to log into the system all the time because maybe there's problems and you're using your rubber mallet to get the door in place, right? Like, it's all of these things that seem really small but add up. So when you have these type of things that are in your roadmap, especially when you think about BestBuy.com going down, and you think of a feature that could be a failover, redundancy, or some type of way to build in a failover, you realize that 75% of traffic could be millions and millions of dollars, especially during a critical time that's like Black Friday type of weekend, where the retailer might do as much business in that weekend as they do in the entire first quarter of their year. So how do you really take small failures that seem really small and figure out, like, oh gosh, this is really incredible amount of developer time we're using, or it's a lot of revenue that's lost, and how do you build this back into your roadmap? So if you enjoyed some of the things that I've been talking about, you might enjoy some of these books. I'm a really big reader, and I love to get book recommendations. So this is a lot of work that has influenced my own work. The books by Tufte on this top left side, this is what I was talking about when you go to one of his presentations and you get all 4 books and you spend 8 hours with him poring over all these different examples, and it's really a beautiful array of work that you can see of how you can make information more accessible to people that are taking it and consuming it. And then the Production Ready Microservices is a great book if you're working on designing an architectural system and thinking about how to design your organization so that you can really influence the technical system that's coming out of it. So yeah, most of these books are about how to innovate more quickly and not to let your competition sneak up on you because you're not paying attention to the right things. How do you really get out of story hell? So I'm Kristen Womack, and you can feel free to I'd love if you reach out to me on Twitter, or that's my direct email. And then I will, of course, share a copy of my presentation. And I left a few minutes at the end, so if you have any questions, I would love to go deeper into any of the examples, or maybe you are facing something in your own organization that you have questions about. So I turn it over to you for questions if there are any. Oh, mm-hmm. Yeah, so this original concept came from Clayton Christensen, who is the author of The Innovator's Dilemma and The Innovator's Solution, and he does a lot of work around innovation. So many people have gone off to further drive home a lot of this example and further his work. And so this is really talking about like getting to strip away those assumptions. So like an example might be like, as a user, I can indicate folders not to back up so that my backup drive isn't filled with things I don't need to be saved. Like already I've forgotten what I've said, right? So as a user is very generic, and it doesn't really lend to have that deeper empathy for what somebody is going through and the job that they're trying to achieve. It's not action-based in terms of like what the person is trying to go from A to B. So, you have your home and then this conference. And so the job to be done is, how do you get from your home to this conference? You might need to employ a couple of planes or train or bus or a bike. And so there are many different ways. So like for long distance travel, you're going to employ a different product than you will for more short distance travel. And so like really thinking about how that works opens up your possibilities and the idea to dig in deeper. Whereas you start to say, as a user, I, what happens is it just becomes very monotonous, and it's not, it's often misses the mark of what you're trying to understand from your user. Does that make sense? Or, yeah. One of the examples they give in the book that's really fascinating is about like driving to work or commuting to work and you want to stop for something to eat. And you think, on my commute, I want to feel cozy or have something to eat. I want to fill my stomach. I want to, I'm tired. I want to get something to drink. And so you might stop and get a coffee. But maybe you've decided caffeine is no longer something that you want to drink, and it's not good for you and makes your heart race, and then you're tired later, and so you decide that you're on this health kick and you want to start juicing, and so then you stop to get a kale juice or a smoothie. And so this idea of now, as somebody who is a person who sells coffee, or I'm a person who sells smoothies, I am realizing that like my competition isn't just other coffee shops, but I am competing with that user between their choice of picking a coffee or a kale smoothie. And so then Alan Clement, who uses the example, he actually has a book that's called When Kale and Coffee Compete. And at first glance at that title, you're like, when would kale and coffee ever compete? That's dumb. But then you dig in and you're like, oh my gosh, that's genius. So, yeah. Other questions? Oh, mm-hmm. No. Mm-mm. I have experienced that in terms of being part of a larger organization. I've worked at companies that are large, small, even just like a 2-person starting a company off the ground. So at all these different levels, it really depends. And it really depends what your position is. So like when I was at a larger corporation, I would have more control just over my department or where I was working. So whenever possible, I like to be able to build this in terms of everyone thinking about it and not have a separate team, because that, I believe, is more like painting it on at the end. But you don't always have the luxury of doing that. When I was leading a product team, a couple years ago, I only had the product managers, user experience designers, and then graphic designers that reported to me. And I had some user researchers, but none of the engineering teams reported to me. So I had no choice to really decide how this work was split up. And so then if we built this into the roadmap, then they would decide which teams built the things that we had. So yeah, then they would separate it into different teams. But in the case of leading the Best Buy API team, I had designers, product managers, BAs, engineers, quality assurance, operations. Everyone reported up through me because I managed the whole entire team. And so in that case, it was really a lot easier to say, let's talk about what's going on. So in the example I gave about the developers at the hackathon, we were able to trace down that we were having not only problems with our form that had like 20 fields, but really how do we shrink that down to 2 or 3 fields and start the communication. And then from there, oh wow, there's a lot of problems with a company that we use called Mashery. Okay, so let's talk to Mashery about how we can figure this out. And then how do we dig through that? And then how do we... So the idea is to like take the customer journey from the very first kernel of what they need to do and really figure out how it's going throughout the whole system. But in larger organizations, it's challenging because you might have your, like in a big, large e-commerce, you might have your like browse products team and then cart team and then checkout team, and you have all these different teams. And so if you don't have consistency across all of them, it is really hard to execute. And so that's why I really wanted to talk about this idea of no matter where you are in whatever organization, however your organization is structured, that you can start to influence. And even if your influence is basically asking questions and just digging deeper and trying to peel the layers off, you'll start to have a ripple effect with the rest of your organization, because you're starting to get to more meaningful questions around your software. And to influence anything, you don't need to necessarily be in a particular position, in my opinion. You can start to influence from other ways. Any final last question? Like when something goes wrong?
Yeah. Probably it's still something else.
Mm-hmm.
Wrong, something unexpected. So if you have like stories, it's kind of organized.
Mm-hmm.
When something disrupts that, like what's your approach?
Yeah, so I like to build for that specific use case. Like, with the idea that you can always change whatever you have past that current iteration. So I personally like to talk a lot about using iterations because it's a cycle in time, whereas I see a lot of the industry talking about using sprints. And this idea of using the word sprint has a lot of meaning of like really go fast to this next thing, and then you're like sprinting again, and then you're sprinting again, and there's just really no longevity to this idea of quick bursts of energy. And so when I think about iterations, I think, okay, we have maybe this year we're going to focus on this, and the quarter that we're looking in is here, and then within that quarter we have our 2-week iteration. So what I would usually talk to about with the business teams or people who are making decisions or stakeholders is, once an iteration has gone in the 2-week period, that's what we're really focused on. So if you want to change anything that's sort of beyond that, that's fine, because we try to aim to design our process so that our stories are small enough that they either fit in 2-week increments or that they can still be, effectively not hindering the rest of the application based on changing things that might not be within that specific story or that theme. So the idea that you can change things gives a lot more flexibility, and it changes the mindset of, things can go wrong. So now in a bigger, like a disaster or emergency, once you've practiced all these things, it's a little bit more easy to execute in terms of, something went wrong. This is how it is when we shift priorities. This is what happens when we do this. And immediately you start to engage in whatever your disciplined processes that you've designed, as opposed to going into this like firefighting, all hands on deck, we're going to be here all night, all weekend, but figuring out like how to have a more sane process and switching off people, and how do you disseminate knowledge so that people can help across the team as opposed to all having it land on one person's shoulders. So really building your process to allow for change is one of the things that I think is a good central tenet to have on your team manifesto, so you can continuously practice that. And the last thing I'll say with it is that it's a lot easier to make changes if you don't have a backlog of features or stories that are hundreds of deep and you're just reshuffling. You have to have the faith that the idea is that if it's a good idea or a good feature, you're not going to lose it. It's going to be so loud that you don't need to have it on this backlog to be able to remember it. So really keeping this idea of these high-level themes and then thinking through it as you get closer to it, because oftentimes you throw away stories because you have new information. So not working too far ahead is another opportunity to be able to respond. And I think that's all the time we have. So if you have more questions, you can find me after the talk. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming to hear my ideas.